Hello, my name is Daniel Unmanageable, and I am here to take the blinders off of mental illness and substance use in the workplace. Welcome to Hard Knox Talks. Today we have our guest is Dwayne Cameron from Saskatoon, and he is here to tell us about what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. Let's see if we can find him. Are you here, Dwayne?
I am standing by, sitting here in my living room, Danny.
Oh, well, we are live. Welcome to the very first episode.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let me see if I can kill this music here. There we go. Awesome. Okay. Well, let's see. How do we get started here? So, tell us a little bit about yourself. I understand you are in long-term recovery. How long has it been now?
Gee, so long, it's hard to add up all the years. Over 36 years I've been in my own personal recovery journey.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's amazing how those one days add up after a while.
Yeah, I can relate. So what was it like? What was it like back in the day before you made the decision?
When dinosaurs roamed the earth and we were trying to get into recovery?
Yeah, so to speak. Well, I think I wanted to start off and just share a little bit. That's actually why I got into the field of working as a substance abuse specialist today, is my own journey and several near life and death experiences brought me to a turning point where I needed to either get my life on track and clean up and sober up, or else my grandmother used to say, Dwayne, you're like a cat with 9 lives, but you've used up at least 8 of 9 of them. So it was time for me to get my life back on track. So, I mean, what was it like? It was craziness. I mean, I thought I was having a good time, and I can tell you some stories that would probably make your hair curl if that's where we want to go a little bit. But long story short is I was very addicted to alcohol and messed around lots with the marijuana. And it wasn't for a few of my good friends that I was around that they kept me away from the harder drugs. Otherwise, I probably would have ended up in that as well. And it nearly took my life several times before I finally came to a turning point and started looking for and getting into recovery. It's amazing, man. So, if you don't mind, why don't you tell us what happened? What was the moment that took you to the decision to make the choice to change your life?
Well, one of the things I call it, both for my own journey and when I'm helping others in their journey, is I call it the pain point. And for me, that pain point was I was out making my mark in the world. I was 19 years old, and me and my best friend from high school decided to meet in Calgary where he was working. And we drank way too much alcohol on a Saturday night, as we often did, because I was in the middle of my dependence to alcohol. I was kind of in middle stages. I was, getting close to crash and burn. And we decided Sunday morning to throw a 6-pack of beer into the rubber dinghy and float down the Bow River in Calgary, if any of you know the area. And we saw the warning sign, says portage, don't go over the weir. And we rode under all of the barricades and rode right up to the edge of the weir. And if you don't know what a weir is on the Bow in Calgary, it drops about 10, 12 feet straight down into the river and then carries on. And we rode right up to the edge of it, actually, and kind of had a look over and back paddled away like we weren't swept right into it. We made a decision after having a little too much alcohol in our systems to think, we got life jackets on. Who cares about the warning signs? And we can paddle through this. We're in a rubber dinghy. We'll just sail on through. Well, we went over, and when we hit the edge of the weir, there's about this much water froth coming back where it curls back. And the rubber dinghy just stuck there like this in the rubber dinghy in the weir. And all of a sudden, I remember my good friend Kelvin looking at me, and he went into the water, and I was kind of hanging on to him while I was still in this rubber dinghy. And then it just sucked him, me, rubber dinghy, and everything underneath into that weir.
Wow.
I found out later on that the time we went over, the July long weekend, that a lot of the mountain water was going through, there was over 300 pounds per square inch suction pulling you into that weir. And it took tied running shoes and socks and just ripped them off my feet to give you a bit of a perspective. And I'm a good swimmer. I grew up as a kid for a couple of years in Jamaica, swimming in waves and undertows, and I had a life jacket on. And that weir sucked me under, spin me around like a washing machine underneath. All of a sudden, it would spit me up. I'd get a little bit of air, down I'd go again.
And you remember all of this? Like, it's still in your mind?
Still in my mind. And this was 30 years ago. And the last thing I remember, well, actually, just before the last thing, I remember somebody yelling, "Swim, swim." And I was so disorientated, it spit me up to the surface. And I started swimming where I thought I was going downstream. And I swam back into the main turmoil. So it sucked me down again. Last thing I remember is being cold, tired, and giving up. And the next thing I knew, I woke up and I was in a paramedic van. Wow. And they were taking me to the hospital and all the things that happened after that. So the part of the story, what was a turning point for me, is a couple of key items. I went back to talk to the guy who was at the side of the weir and threw a rope in there. And he said he tried to fish for my buddy Kelvin, who was right by the wall. He couldn't get a hold of him, then he disappeared, but he saw me bob up, go down, a little further down. So we went down to the shoreline, threw this rope out about 20, 30 feet. How I got a hold of it, he does not know. And he said I was hanging on to the end. And he's a fairly big guy, like, I don't know, 6 feet, couple 100 pounds. He said it took all he could to stand at the side of that river to haul me in while I'm flailing around in that weir still hanging on to the other end of this rope.
And you still had the strength to hang on to that rope?
Yeah.
Do you remember hanging on to the rope?
I do not remember that. I'm telling you, that's part of what the guy told me when I went and found the guy who helped pull me out of the weir that day before the fire rescue got there.
Wow.
And then he said he got me to the shore, kind of pried my fingers off the rope because he could still see Kelvin every once in a while. So he was going to go back in because I was sputtering, but I was breathing and I was in shock and everything. And he said, all I was saying over and over was, "Thank God, thank God." And I actually, at the time, I had no faith at the time. I thought he was some religious nut and was going to start preaching at me. So I kind of ended the conversation at that point. But it was a spiritual experience, even though I wasn't spiritual at the time. And the end of that story is that my good friend Kelvin stayed in coma for a couple months, but they figured there was no brain activity. He never came out of coma, and they finally pulled the plug and let him pass away. And why that was a turning point for me is because I really felt I had some trauma along the way, but that was a big trauma event and loss for me in my life and my substance using. And I actually started drinking pretty hard after that and almost committed suicide in that weir a few months later. And I remember that, screaming at that weir, throwing beer bottles into it, saying, "You're not going to get me." And I turned and walked away. And that was the beginning of me starting to reach out for help and looking at my alcoholism and starting to get my life on track.
Wow.
So that was
an incredible story.
Yeah, it was a life-changing story. Now, to say it was easy from there isn't wrong, but it wasn't easy. But it was the part where inside I was going, okay, something's got to change here, And it was a key turning point for me to start asking for help. And then the next one is my common law wife. A few years later, I kept drinking and got in a relationship and back and forth. She finally left one night when I was in an alcoholic party and said, "I'm not coming back till you do something about your drinking." And so she, we were only 20 years old at the time, and she had the sense of somewhere to say, "I'm not coming back till you do something about your drinking problem." And that was the final straw for me. I said, okay, we had a 2-year-old son and a lady that I was in love with. And I screamed at her. I said, "Oh, I'm not an alcoholic." She said, "I don't know whether you are or you aren't, but I'm not coming back until you do something about this drinking." And so a week later, I went to my first recovery meeting, and I never looked back since. Now that's,
wow.
So again, it wasn't simple, but I started putting one foot in front of the other and reaching out and figuring out, okay, my life was a mess and alcohol was a key part of it. And how do I live life on life's terms and start getting back without the alcohol and healing from all of this that I had been through, my pain and my turning point. So that was the beginning for me.
So what were the first few years like? The first few years of your recovery journey?
To be honest, it was tough in the beginning. And one of my mottos was if I couldn't have fun being clean and sober, then I'd probably be back using. Because I'm just an outgoing kind of fun-loving guy and like to have fun. but alcohol became too much a part of that fun. So the first couple of years were tough because I was like, where do I go to have fun? Most of the things I started realizing involved alcohol. So what I did is I started hanging around people that were in recovery programs, that didn't drink much. And I had to find new places to make friends where people didn't party the way I used to party. But that took some time. It took figuring things out as far as where do these people hang out. Going to some recovery meetings is the way I went. There's lots of different places where people hang out that there is no or very minimal alcohol. And that's where I just really had to work at spending the time and then getting some counseling and working through. Is that your noise in the background? That's not me, is it?
What noise are you hearing?
I just heard sounded like an animal groaning or something.
Oh yeah, that was my son. He's in the other room. He yawned. I was hoping you guys didn't hear that, but yes, okay. There is a child here somewhere. He's got headphones on. He can't hear us, but we can hear him.
Oh, there you go. All right, just want to make sure there was nothing coming through on mine. So I had to find new ways how to have fun without the alcohol and connect with supports and people. And I got into some counseling. Somebody that really understood about alcohol and pain and trauma and started showing me and coaching me on ways to work through my pain and my trauma so that I didn't need to use the alcohol to numb it anymore, because that's really where I had ended up at the end of my journey for sure.
Wow. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
So tell me, tell us about what it's like now. Where has your journey brought you? What are you doing now to make a difference?
Well, one of the things that I did in my first 3 to 5 years of recovery is I really ended up doing a lot of volunteering and helping out in different ways, and really discovered that I really enjoy helping people. And so I went back to school and got my diploma in addictions counseling, and later on finished a degree in humanities with clinical counseling background. So that all leads up to what I'm actually doing now. I've been working in the counseling field, specifically with addictions and mental health. And for me, it's become it was from day one. It is a calling. For some people it's a job, and it's a great job if that's what you like. But for me, it's a job I enjoy because I enjoy helping people. But it's also a passion for me because my profession turned into my calling, or my calling turned into my profession. Really, is how it ended up. So what am I doing now? Right now, I'm working as an addiction specialist with a specialty with mental health and addictions both. So I work with people who might just be coming in with some high anxiety or depression. And usually I get the folks where there's some substance use mixed in there, and they're not sure whether it's a problem or how it's contributing. And so because I can work with both areas, I often get folks who are interested and want to talk about figuring that part out in their journey. So I do a lot of one-on-one counseling. But I don't like doing full-time 30 hours a week and nose-to-nose counseling, as we call it, just because I find it pretty emotionally draining. So I like about half of the time at least doing training. So I've really moved into training other counselors how to do stuff. I'm working lots with employers now on how do you recognize when somebody's maybe some impairment on the job, and how do you intervene or get them some help in a helpful way, rather than the way I ended up not getting help when I was in my substance abuse at 20 years old and was on my 8th job at 20 years old, because sometimes they fire you and let you go when you keep showing up intoxicated or hungover and you can't really do your job. And that's where I was 30 some years ago. So I really enjoy the training, the teaching, the empowering others, whether it's an employer, employees, or in a one-to-one counseling, and do a blend of that stuff in my work now. And I've been working in the profession now for over 30 years. So cool. That's the highlights of what I'm doing right now.
So I understand that you do some training and education for employees in safety sensitive jobs.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about that.
Well, one of the things that I'm passionate about is making sure that both the employers and the employees understand the impacts substances can have. And when I say substances, I mean everything, whether that's alcohol, and you show up on the job the next day, and everybody, lots of people think, well, I'm not drunk, so I can go to work. Well, you know, alcohol has a lot of other impairing factors when you're hungover and you're tired and all that kind of stuff. So really enjoy helping the employees understand, like, you want to go to work and be able to be on your A game kind of thing. You want to be able to make sure that you can do the job well to your potential, but also make sure that you and others are safe around there. We're really, you know, employers are getting more and more concerned and taking more positive steps around how do we create that safety culture in the workplace. And so, you know, I'm involved as well with helping, you know, the supervisors recognize how do you see if somebody's impaired potentially, and how do you handle that in a healthy way. And
so what do you call that? What do you call that training that you offer?
Reasonable suspicion training, fit for duty. So recognizing if people are fit for duty, if there's an impairment, and how do you go through some steps in order to handle that and recognize it, identify it, and address it in a healthy way is the summary. So we teach supervisors and educate the employers on how to do that in a healthy way.
So plus, is that a diligent part of a good drug and alcohol plan, this training?
Oh yeah, for sure. Employers have a responsibility these days to educate, train, make sure the workplace is safe in a variety of ways, and fit for duty is one of the safety areas and potential impairment. And it's not just alcohol and drugs that can cause impairment. There's lots of other things. So, but my specialty is the alcohol and the drugs, and I've really developed a specialty. I've got a real interest and passion in the area of cannabis, especially since it's been legalized. We're seeing it really starting to impact. It's always been around, but now that it's legal, I'm seeing anyway from my angle of doing education sessions with employees who've maybe, you know, ended up failing a drug test at a safety sensitive work environment. That's an area that I'm doing lots of work with the employees themselves and doing mini education sessions one-on-one with them, as well as in employee sites to the employees.
So you're actually a part of their return to work plan? Is that what you're telling us?
In a sense, yeah. And if education is part of their return to work plan and they need some specific safety sensitive drug and alcohol education, that's a key specialty that's where
Dwayne shows up.
So
okay.
Yeah. And you know, if somebody gets an assessment from a substance abuse professional where it says, geez, they tested positive at work for a substance, but they don't have a dependency issue. Maybe they've been using and abusing and it's impacting their work. A common recommendation, if there's no substance use issue, is 2 hours of safety sensitive education connected to the substance that they were testing positive for in the workplace. So that's where I come in and spend some time. And we can really dive deep into that. Not just canned education. I have the key pieces of information I like to make sure that they understand related to the drug and how it affects safety sensitive, but then really personalized for them. When you've got 2 hours one-on-one, you can really dive in a little bit deeper on the education for them.
Cool. So what have you seen? Have you seen any changes with cannabis in the workplace since legalization?
Oh my goodness. Are we only an hour on this, or we get 2 hours?
We'll see how interesting it is.
All right. Well, and you just cut me off because you can tell I'm passionate about this stuff. So I'll give you some highlights to it, and you just maybe dive in a little bit deeper where you think some of the folks or your audience or yourself might be interested. The first question or answer to your question is, I have seen an amazing amount and an increase. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I didn't stop and calculate them. But before, when I was doing safety sensitive education specific kinds of one-on-ones, sometimes they'd roll in a little bit of basic information about cannabis before legalization, and we'd see the odd one. But now, since marijuana has been legalized, let me just stop and think for a second. I would say 70 to 80% of my one-on-ones, cannabis is the main drug that they were positive for. And now they're going into an education session with me because they tested positive on a safety sensitive work environment. So what does that mean? And I'm seeing I get quite a few referrals. One of my main referrals is from the To Be Sure company, but they send me lots. But I do other ones as well. So I probably on an average do 1 or 2 a week of those education specific and safety sensitive. So hundreds in the area of cannabis.
Wow. So you said what? To Be Sure?
To Be Sure Consulting. Yeah, they have their specialty, and they have a couple of folks that are certified as substance abuse professionals to be able to do an assessment for safety sensitive work environment on whether somebody actually has a problem or not, and what they need as far as returning to work safely.
Okay, so they make the decision whether a worker should go to, say, inpatient treatment center or outpatient things, or come to you for an education session.
Right.
Okay.
Based on an in-depth assessment, they can tell what are the red flags with them, and as far as moving along from regular use, regular abuse into substance use disorder around the substance or not. And they have some extra certification in order to have the skills and the certification to make that determination. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So of all of the people that these To Be Sure assesses, how many of them only need a simple education session and they can return to work? Like how many have a substance use disorder, and how many just need to be educated and they can go back?
Well, because I don't see all their numbers, I'm not exactly sure the numbers. However, my guess would be a good percentage just need some education. Like they're kind of on that continuum moving along. And if they didn't get some education and make some different decisions, they could certainly move into a substance use disorder. How many? I'm really not sure. My wild guess would be just from being in workplaces and things like that, because we're catching employers are trying to notice problems and send them to some resources sooner. I think we need to get way better than that, but at least we're better than where we were a few years ago, or at least 20, 30 years ago for sure. So all that to say that, I think my wild guess, and don't quote me on the numbers, would be like, probably 70-ish% or so just needs some information and understanding to make some different decisions. And then others have more significant issues and they need other referrals and into, say, some residential inpatient, outpatient treatment, things like that.
Okay, cool. So here's a hypothetical. Say I'm a safety sensitive employee. I'm doing safety sensitive duties, and I have a prescription. I have a prescription for marijuana. I have a doctor backing me, say that this guy needs marijuana to function as a normal human being. Can I perform safety sensitive functions? Can I be a truck driver? Can I operate heavy equipment?
The short answer, no. Now, safety sensitive employers the law is going to sort that out eventually. But the short answer is, just because you have a prescription and you can legally use cannabis, medical cannabis, does not necessarily mean you're fit for duty. There could still be some impairment. It's just like any other drug, right? If I go to my doctor because I got bad back issues and I get some pain medication to manage my pain properly, I still need to be aware and alert and able to operate that crane, to use your example. And so there's different ways and tools that can try to measure and make sure that I'm not impaired. And both myself as the employee and the employer have some responsibility to go, are you really fit for duty or not? Just because you have a prescription and I'm taking them as prescribed does not necessarily mean I am not impaired. And therefore, if I'm impaired, I need to be accommodated if the place can accommodate me, or move to other duties where I'm not in a safety sensitive environment.
That's interesting stuff. Hey, I can see how some people might get lost in that.
For sure. And you know what? The THC that gets you high in the marijuana is one of the only drugs of all of the drugs that is fat soluble. Now, why are you sharing that with me, Dwayne? Well, it's the only one that actually sticks around in the fat cells, and you have a lot of fat in your brain to make your brain work properly. So it can mess with the functioning. And marijuana is kind of like a slow fog kind of thing. You don't really notice it. It doesn't seem that bad. And you might be able to function okay with some levels of THC in there. However, the problem is the impairment line can vary a little bit from person to person. And if you and I decided, because it's legal now, we'll have a smoke a marijuana joint together on a Saturday night, I'm still going to be testing positive for THC, the average person, 5 to 7 days later if we've only used it once. So, so the urine screens indicate that you've used some marijuana at some point, but they're not a good tool for measuring actual impairment at the time. They just say, hey, you've got some THC in your system.
So you could test positive, and you could activate their reasonable. Or sorry, how does this work now? You could test positive, not be impaired, and still see the ramifications from the drug and alcohol policy.
That is correct. And I have seen a lot of folks in my education sessions that just didn't understand that. They decided, oh, it's legal, I'll try a little bit now that it's legal on a Saturday night. They run into a urine screen the following Wednesday or Thursday in a safety-sensitive work environment, and boom, now they're going to have to see a substance abuse professional, get a whole assessment. They figure, oh, you don't really have a problem, go see Dwayne and get some education. They're going, what? I thought I passed the test.
Yeah.
And I'm even talking to some folks who are using it legitimately for some pain issues, very small amounts, and didn't realize that they weren't going to pass a urine screen, and they were in safety-sensitive environments, right? Part of the problem is, where is that impairment, right? There's some of the research is indicating that people can be mildly to medium impaired from the THC they smoked 24 to 48 hours later.
Wow.
And that's some of the research. We need more. One of the good things about legalization, and this is now that at least we can get some more research going and kind of get more of a baseline around, when are folks impaired and at what level of THC in the bloodstream rather than just the fat, because you can have THC sticking. If you're a regular user of marijuana, you can have THC sticking around for weeks and weeks and not be able to pass a urine screen.
So are there any test alternatives out there that will more accurately measure the THC in the blood, like in the moment?
Yes, there's saliva tests is what they're using. That's what they're experimenting with, what level of THC from a saliva test that actually says this is active THC in your bloodstream at the moment. So it gives a more accurate picture. Now the research has got to figure out, okay, well, are you impaired at 5 nanograms of THC in your bloodstream, 10, 15? So some of the safety-sensitive industries are experimenting with that.
So how they would do it with alcohol then, like 0.04, 0.08, they have to put a number on it so they know, okay, this is what this is going to be our benchmark. If you're above this, then you're impaired.
Exactly. Yeah. So the research needs to catch up and kind of establish that benchmark, and they're working on that, right? And just like with alcohol, right? Everybody is going to be, if you're behind the wheel at 0.08 in Saskatchewan, you're going to be charged with a 0.08, a point in impaired driving. That's the benchmark. Now, I may be at a 0.8. Hopefully people are wise enough now and are learning from the drinking and driving experiences and all the stuff that the promoting we're doing. But if you're drinking, don't drive. But some people still take a risk. Oh, I've only had a couple drinks, and they look normal, but in their blood alcohol, if they look normal, acting normal, and their blood BAC is 0.8, they're still getting charged with impaired. So they're using that same process with THC. So to give you an example, you go into a roadside check stop right now. They're using a saliva test to check for THC and other drugs. Their THC cutoff, which with the saliva indicates how much THC is in the bloodstream, is at 5 nanograms. So if you have that, you fail. It's just kind of like a roadside pass-fail. So it's telling them that there's enough THC in your blood system that they're going to send you downtown. You're going to spend some time with the officer who's a drug recognition expert, who's got extra training to determine and run you through hand-eye motor coordination, a bunch of things that they do. See, are you impaired behind the wheel? And if you are, then they charge you with impaired driving. So that's their process they're using on the road to make sure to keep the roads safe for people who choose to smoke marijuana and get behind the wheel. And so they're borrowing some of that research and establishing it in there, and that's to try and move some of that into, is there a level that we can establish with safety sensitive? But because I just want to add to that with safety sensitive, what we're noticing, or what I'm noticing with safety sensitive employers, there's lots of them still that are going, you know what? It's complicated. Let's let them figure it out. Our alcohol and drug policy says 0 tolerance. So if you test positive with THC on a urine screen, we don't care if you used it a week ago and you're not really impaired on the job.
They have to practice.
Their policy says X, Y, and Z happens. So they're taking a zero tolerance approach for now.
Well, and they have to be diligent.
Sorry?
Yeah, they have to be diligent. They have to follow their policy, or else, they're in violation of legislation. That's
right. And so some safety sensitive employers are choosing to just keep the 0 tolerance, which, quite frankly, it's the easier way to navigate through. You don't have to try and guess. At the end of the day, if you've got anything in your system, there's potential for impairment that needs to be figured out. And at the end of the day, they want everybody going home safe is the whole idea, right?
Hear, hear. That's why we're here.
And I think one of the things that goes through my mind, and I was thinking about this and getting ready for the podcast today, when I had my weir incident and I was drinking pretty hard, I was working in the construction environment. And I won't tell you much more than that to save the employer, but I remember it was 30 some years, more than 30 years ago now. But I was showing up so hungover some mornings for work that my team lead knew that I probably shouldn't have been there, but they didn't know how. They cared about it. They knew that I'd been through a tough situation with my friend and I was drinking hard and I'm showing to work hungover. Sometimes I probably would have blew the breathalyzer out. Actually, I was more than hungover. So what did they do? They'd put me in the corner counting and stacking widgets. I won't tell you what I was actually stacking because that might give you the employer away, but it gives you an idea because employers are struggling with how to handle that. Whereas today, our training, we've got more safety stuff. We're going, hey, how can you have a crucial conversation with that employee to hopefully connect them to some services, get them some support, maybe have them see a substance abuse professional, hopefully even sooner to get some things, probably dealing with some of the mental health stuff. We're finally talking more about those kinds of things and getting people some support and services so that they can be fit for duty and back on the job in a healthy way where they're safe for themselves and others. So we're learning ways. We still got a ways to go, but we're learning more and trying to create that safety culture now and get some people some services and support they need rather than just, oh, sorry, Dwayne, you're fired because you've showed up and, hungover 4 days. One of my first construction jobs, I showed up the second week on the job hungover and really, oh no, I missed the work because I was hungover. And he said, well, that's it, you're fired. Like, that's just the way they did it back. Some still are the old school, they just fire you. Well, that doesn't solve the problem. I was just on to the next employer with my same problem and bringing that to the next workplace. And we're trying to get some education information and some help out there for the employee who needs it and can get their life back on track.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think we're coming close to the end here. We'll get into a few question and answers here. Let's see what we've got. We've got a few questions in the chat.
Sure.
Where do we start here? We've got Claudia from Saskatoon. Can you see that, Dwayne?
I can. She's asking, what do you think about the concept of harm reduction?
What does it say? What do you think about the concept of harm reduction and how does that all work in the workplace? That is a good question.
That's a thoughtful question, I can tell.
Claudia likes to think, I think.
Well, my first response is harm reduction is an approach where you're really trying to engage people when they're already quite involved in substances and see if you can engage them in some services while reducing some of the risks of harm around the abuse of the substances, the health risks, all that kind of stuff. So harm reduction works to try and engage people in the services, build that working relationship with them. One of my pet peeves around harm reduction, and this is me speaking as from recovery and as a professional both, is we offer harm reduction without the resources to really wrap around or give the services, get those services to the folks we're offering the harm reduction to. So in other words, if I'm working in Vancouver in a harm reduction needle exchange, I don't want to just come in and you give me the needles and give news. I mean, that does reduce some harm from infectious control perspective. But as we're exchanging those needles, I'm saying to you, Dan, how are you really doing? How's things going? Do you want a cup of coffee? Okay, so let's just have a cup of coffee, like really engaging them. And how are you really doing with your substance use? Have you thought about, working on that yet? I mean, there's 101 ways that you can engage people. I worked with high-risk youth in Prince Albert for 10 years. And a good part of that was out on the streets. And we were quite successful, but we were on the edge with harm reduction and how to engage. And it's really building that bridge of rapport first while you wrap the services around them without diving too deep. How does that work in a workplace? Well, if the person's actively using, the first thing is you've got to reduce that risk of impairment if it's safety sensitive. So it won't work very well in a safety sensitive environment if somebody's using substances that can create potential impairment on the job. So that would need to be figured out between employee and employer. Maybe there's some work accommodations where as they're working things out, they can do some jobs where there's not going to be any safety risks. So it becomes really complicated more in the workplace when you're talking harm reduction. A lot of the harm reduction strategies are used for those folks who are further along in their substance use, and lots of times they are at a place where they've lost their employment, they're struggling to stay employed because the substance use has actually taken over their life, that they need to work on that before they can even kind of get back into some employment. At least that's what I think of when I think of harm reduction from that perspective.
Well, you did a better job of answering that than I think I would have. So
that's just 30 years experience. You'll answer it probably better in 30 years, Dan.
Well, we'll see. Okay, well, what else do we got here? Let's see. We've got Derek from Saskatoon.
Hey, Derek.
Yeah. So what is Derek? He says, can employers do random drug substance testing on workers?
Ooh, that's a loaded one. And I'm not an expert in that area, but here's my experience in working with some of my colleagues who are trained, especially the substance abuse professionals who are Department of Transport trained and certified. They really dive into the legality of all this. But here's the big picture overview, is that in Canada, they cannot do, and we don't even call it randoms. They changed the language in Canada. They can do unannounced drug screens, okay, if it's clearly communicated, it's in their alcohol drug policy, so whatever the policy trumps. So if you go to a job and their policy says, yeah, we, one of parts of our alcohol and drug policy is once a year we do, sometime in the year we'll do a unannounced drug screening because we want to make sure everybody is coming to work with no substances in their system, then they can do that, because often what they'll do is they'll have you sign off on something that you've read through the alcohol drug policy and you agree to it so that everything is on the up and up communicated and you understand the consequences if you violate the alcohol drug policy. So just on a side note with that, lots of times in the safety sensitive work and the education pieces that I've been doing, if a person does test positive, and even though they don't have a problem, the SAPs, for short, substance abuse professionals, are often recommending after the education, kind of an industry standard in safety sensitive environments is that they have 6 unannounced drug tests over the next year, just as a way to keep some accountability. And that's one of the recommendations. And then the employers put that back in their return to duty part of their agreement, in addition to their whatever's in their actual drug policy.
Cool. Right on. Well, there you go, Derek. So what else do we got? I think we got a couple more. We've got one from Trisha here. Do you ever have workers say, I don't feel impaired, I'm used to using cannabis?
I was going to say daily, but I don't think it's quite daily. Almost. It's a very common question. It's very good. Because lots of times, remember, one of the things that most drugs do is they impair the first part of the brain. And you don't have to have a problem with this. The first part of your brain that is impacted by the use of a mood-altering substance is your inhibitions, your fear drops a little bit, your decision-making can be a little bit skewed. And so you might be mildly impaired, but think you're doing just wonderful. And my most favorite example is when I was helping out with impaired driving impaired driving programs, we used to show a couple of the videos, and one of my favorite was a documented professional drivers. They put them through a course with cones and everything to show where their baseline ability was, and then they would give them some alcohol, test their blood alcohol at 0.04, put them through, and they said, "No, we're feeling pretty good." And all of a sudden there's a cone flying, like they weren't 100% on their A game, and they thought, "Well, I was doing pretty good, but I clipped a couple of cones on the same course and weren't doing quite as well as they were when they were 100% sober and not impaired." And then they put them through at 0.08, and they thought, "Yeah, I'm okay. I mean, I'm a little tipsy, but I can handle it." Wow, they were messing up on the track left, right, and center. So professional drivers think they're good to go, and then they get in the situation, they're impaired. Then the rest of us need to listen to that, I think, and take heed from that experience. Mm-hmm. And we're running into it a lot with cannabis. I mean, one of my favorite research articles to share with people is the pilot research. And there's some mixed, there's some critics about it and everything else. Actually, if I win the lottery, I'm going to redo the pilot research with the higher level THC that we have today, because that's the other thing, right? The THC levels in the pot people are smoking today is nothing different. There's nothing compared to 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. But anyways, the whole essence of that, the marijuana pilot survey is this. They got a bunch of pilots high, not a bunch, I think they used 10 in this one survey, and put them through the survey. And once they got them high, they actually put them in a flight simulator, and as they expected, they're crashing, they're not flying an airplane very well, they shouldn't be in the cockpit. The surprising part is, and I'm just giving you the Reader's Digest version here, they got a little bit better, but were still very impaired as they tested their level of THC in the bloodstream. But here's the clincher of this research I want your listeners to take home today. 24 hours later, they brought these pilots back in after they'd been high before, and they said, "How do you feel?" "Well, a little fuzzy." "Do you feel good to go?" "Yes." Climbed in the cockpit, went through the flight simulator. They were good with all their usual basic safety stuff, and they didn't feel impaired. But here's what they found. Flying, kind of like driving an airplane, or driving a car and flying an airplane, have some similar hand, mind, body kind of coordination things. When they needed to be on their A game, for example, when they're coming in for a landing and you get a wind gust and the plane goes like this, you got to make split-second decisions. Hand-eye motor coordination, can I put this plane on the ground? Or do I need to get on the power now and get around safely and get back in? It's my favorite example. And what happened is those pilots were not on their A game. They're sliding off the runway. Some of them even crashed. They were not making their best decisions when they needed to be on their A game with their hand-eye motor coordination and quick thinking skills. 24 to 48 hours later. That was some pretty eye-opening research. So yeah, we may feel that we're okay. And the other thing, to give people who maybe are regular users of cannabis and not in safety sensitive kind of environments a bit of the benefit here is that you can develop tolerance and the body will start to adjust so that it can function at a higher and higher level of tolerance and impairment. But it doesn't mean you're not impaired. And if you're in a safety sensitive environment, you really need to be able to have an accurate way to get a sense of, can I be on my A game when push comes to shove, especially if I'm in safety sensitive work environment, or I'm climbing behind the wheel to drive me and my kids to soccer practice, So there's lots of new research that needs to come out on where and how and are you impaired in what levels with the THC, especially in that area.
Yeah, we've actually got a pilot watching tonight. He left a comment here. He said, in aviation, we couldn't be subjected to drug and alcohol tests except after an accident or where there was reasonable suspicion. Now, personally, to me, I find that wild that they don't have that they can't just do that. I mean, pilot, that is a very safety sensitive position. Yeah,
I have my private pilot license, so I agree with you.
Yeah.
I want to be on my A game just for my own safety. Never mind if I'm got a couple hundred passengers behind me. So yeah, that's interesting. It must have been. I'd be curious to maybe dive into that a little bit on what some of the alcohol drug policy is for some of the different aviation companies now, and whether they have, the ability written right in their policy to do unannounced drug tests. I'm not sure. I'd have to check that one out. But that's interesting. Thanks for that, Jeff.
Yeah.
Because really after an accident, and that's pretty common in any safety sensitive industry, right? Post incident, or unless they got reasonable suspicion, but really after the fact, I mean, it's already hit the fan. So if there was, if there's they do that as far as figuring out the cause and what happened and hopefully putting in some prevention for later on. But the accident's already happened if it's after an incident. And we want to try and get ahead of this and prevent things a little bit more so that, people are fit for duty and ready to go, whether there's, and if there's any potential impairment, we handle that in a healthy way to get people the help if they need that. Or, because sometimes one of the things I use when I'm doing the impaired and the safety sensitive education pieces is, impairment could be that you were up half the night with a sick kid and you're just too tired. That can cause impairment and you're not on your A game. So you maybe need to just take a sick day and go home and sleep and rest up. I mean, that could be part of the impairment, or it could come from other things.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So I think we've got time for one more question here. We've got Derek again. We already touched on this, and he asked, have you seen cases rise since legislation? Now, we did already talk about that, but he asked another one here talking about COVID-19. Have you seen a rise in educations in impairment since the beginning of the pandemic?
Well, I saw a slowdown for a little bit, but I think that's just because everybody was in the shock and there wasn't a lot of testing going on and things like that. But I've seen it come back up. And one of the things that as a substance abuse specialist that I took note of is in the first month that we were on COVID and lockdown back in March and April, our alcohol sales in Saskatchewan jumped 34%. I don't have the exact numbers in my head around cannabis, but I know they also jumped because now they can track who's buying through the legal retail outlets with cannabis. So yes, people were using more as a way to cope. I'm seeing more in my clinical practice as well, where people are just not doing well with the stress. So maybe they were kind of a regular recreational, using a little bit more too much at times, but now they're using more as a way to cope with all of that stressors and COVID and all the things that are going with that. So I'm seeing people who are kind of hanging on and managing their stress. Now they're using more substances, and now that's causing them more problems, and they're moving along that continuum towards substance abuse. And if they've had a little bit of awareness and insight, the good news is some of them are trying to reach out faster to get some help and some services, which is good. But certainly seeing a large increase both on the therapeutic, reaching out for help, and in the education sessions now around safety sensitive work environments and people getting into trouble at work because they're not fit for duty, and substances have been involved for sure. Lots of truck drivers.
Yeah.
I didn't see a lot of truck drivers before, but the whole industry has really started to ramp up, making sure we're safe, and a bunch of the safety things, including fit for duty stuff. And quite frankly, some of the truck drivers didn't even know. They had an edible candy at Uncle Frank's on the weekend, thinking it would help their arthritis, and all of a sudden they get an unannounced drug test as a driver. They do those things, especially if you go into the States. They do unannounced all the time. And all of a sudden they have THC in their system, and they find themselves going through the process. So part of it is a little bit more, they're looking at that, but also people just aren't aware on how marijuana affects their system, and especially when it comes to safety sensitive work environment.
Good stuff, man. Well, thanks for all that information. I think we've got all the questions answered for tonight. I don't really have any closing music yet, but let's see what I can do here. Oh, there we go. We got it. Okay, well, Dwayne, well, thank you very much for coming on tonight. I appreciate it very much. And let's see, what else can I say? Next week, my friend Eddie is coming on, and he is going to tell us about what it was like for him with a substance use disorder, trying to hold down a job and fly under the radar. So that should be interesting. So please tune in for that.
I agree. That will be interesting. I'll be tuning in. I'd love to hear his experience.
Yeah, me too. I'm looking forward to it. If you are an employer and you have questions about impairment at work, or you have an idea that you'd like me to talk about on the show, drop me an email at danielunmanageable@gmail.com. If you are a person struggling with a substance use disorder and you don't know where to turn, you can also send me a message. Please send me a message at that same email, danielunmanageable@gmail.com. I know people who can help. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time on Hard Knocks Talks. Good night.
Nice.